Hey y'all, this is a recap of week 3. So let's look at what we learned this week. All right, let's look here. What did we learn about? We learned about culture. Okay, it's in our vocabulary. We learned about culture, behaviors and beliefs characteristic of a particular group. And we talked about 4 different groups this week. We talked about the Southeastern, the Western Gulf, the Plains Indian, and the Pueblo culture. Okay, and specific to those cultures, we talked about things like nomads. What is a nomad as different from somebody who lives in a permanent home, for example. We talked about allies, right? Working together right here versus doing this. Okay. We talked about wigwams, a portable hut made by the Karankawa. And we talked about teepees, which were also portable homes, this time made by Plains Indians. All right, so one of the things we talked about here was, we talked about the 10 Native American tribes, right? We looked at this map. Over here in East Texas, we talked about the Wichita, the Caddo, and the Atacama. Okay? These 3 tribes made up the southeastern culture. And we came down here to the Karankawa and the Coahuiltecan along the coast. And these folks made up the western Gulf culture. Okay? And then we talked about the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Apache, and the Tonkawa. And these 4 tribes made up the Plains culture. And lastly, we had the Jumano, which made up the Pueblo culture. Now, when we discussed these 4 culture groups, we talked about them in reference to the region of Texas that they lived in and how that particular region, given its climate, given its geography, and the natural resources, how that region influenced the tribe's decision for food and shelter. That was the big key takeaway. And in addition to that, we discussed some of the similarities and the differences. Now, for some of the classes, I held up this image right here, right? If some of you guys know what a Venn diagram is. So when we're talking about these cultures, we're talking about, culture 1 versus culture 2, and we're looking at what those cultures have that are unique, and then we're looking at what those cultures have in common. Okay, and so when we talk about, for example, when we talk about the Southeastern, we talked about how the Southeastern culture were expert farmers, right? The Caddo practiced crop rotation. Okay, the Atacama also farmers, but because they lived along the coast, they also practiced fishing. Okay, we talked about how the Western Gulf culture primarily fished, hunted and gathered, right? Not so much did they engage in farming as they did fishing and hunting and gathering. Okay, and then we talked about farmers and how farmers live in permanent settlements and how hunter-gatherers lived in portable homes, right? The difference between a nomad and those who stay in one spot. Okay, farmers stay in one spot. Hunters and gatherers follow the food source. They're nomadic. Nomads live in portable homes. Sometimes those portable homes are called wigwams, right? The Karankawa in the Western Gulf lived in wigwams. However, the Plains Indians, also nomads, primarily dependent upon buffalo as their food source, lived in teepees, okay? They're both houses, they're just called by a different name, right? And then lastly, we talked about the Jumano. And we remember the Jumano were doing a little bit of both. They were doing a little bit of farming along the Rio Grande, right? They were doing a little bit of hunting and gathering. They were hunting some buffalo if they had the ability, right? Because the buffalo are running around out here. And then lastly, they were doing some trading. And we saw a picture of the Pueblo. And Pueblo, in Pueblo culture, Pueblo means town or village or city. And we saw that they made their homes from adobe brick. Okay, those are not portable, so they lived in permanent settlements. That's what we covered this week, and we tried to make those connections between the tribes and those specific cultures and tie it back to the region of Texas, right? Was that region of Texas wet? Did it provide fertile soil? Was it expansive, right? Was there a lot of land like in the Central and Great Plains? Or was it really dry and rocky? And depending on those geographic factors, the climate, the resources available, it really helped determine how those tribes in those particular cultures lived, right? Whether they lived in a permanent home, whether they made their permanent home out of grass and branches, or whether they made it out of adobe brick. Whether they were nomads, they had to follow their food source. Whether they were able to fish, because they did live near the coast. Or if they couldn't fish because they lived out here in the Central and Great Plains and therefore had plenty of buffalo to choose from. So they got really good at riding horses and shooting buffalo and shooting their bow and arrow, right? So that's what we tied it back to, okay? Region, influences, housing, and food, okay? I'm gonna leave it there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Next week, we're gonna talk about exploration, specifically Europeans, which we touched on a little bit this week, and how when the Europeans came over, it kind of drastically changed the way of life. Not kinda, it did forever. Changed the way of life for Native Americans. And specifically when we talked about it this week, we referenced diseases, right? It's the one thing that all of these Native American tribes had in common was they faced European disease, which they just couldn't deal with. So we'll get into that next week. All right, you guys have a great weekend. Daniel's out.